Cassidy clenched his jaw so hard his temples throbbed. The Oshkosh's diesel engine screamed at the edge of its limits, barely drowning out the grinding of his teeth and the rattle of loose brackets. The truck lurched through deep craters carved into the ruined Kansas highway, the road reduced to an obstacle course. The vibration, amplified by the exoskeleton's hydraulics, hammered his joints with a vicious, cramping pain that radiated through his knees and elbows in a dull, relentless ache. The cramped cargo hold reeked of diesel, stale sweat, and the sharp bite of ozone from overheated servos. Dim instrument LEDs cast a sickly blue light across haggard faces. 6 soldiers, encased in steel and composite, gripped the heavy handles of their Mjolnirs. Their fingers inside tactical gloves had gone numb long ago, curling into lifeless hooks welded permanently to their weapons. Sergeant Dina Wallace jerked to her feet. She moved with a terrifying mechanical precision, ignoring the violent jolting as if her body were a natural extension of the vehicle's hydraulic system. Wallace worked her way methodically through the team, checking harness locks, magnetic safeties, and coolant levels in the backpacks. She didn't look at her soldiers' faces. Her own had become a concrete mask, inhabited only by cold, calculating eyes. The truck slammed hard into another break in the road. The soldiers were thrown into each other with a heavy, muffled crunch. Metal on metal clashing filled the entire hold, drowning out even the engine noise. Corporal Miller, wedged inside the massive frame of his hauler suit, swore low and filthy when his shoulder drove into the wall. The heavy hydraulics of his suit hissed in protest, bleeding excess pressure in a jet of white steam. "Settle down!" Wallace shouted over the engine, not even swaying. "Check your coil locks. 25 miles to 0. Brace for the heat strike." Cassidy looked down at his hands. His fingers, stained with oil that wouldn't wash out anymore, were visibly shaking. 9 days ago, he'd been knee-deep in mud on his farm outside Wichita, coaxing a busted tractor back to life and praying for rain. Now he was Grunt. Another line in an endless write-off list, sealed inside a multi-million-dollar sarcophagus. Next to him, Petrov breathed heavily. His eyelid twitched in a feverish rhythm matched to the tires hammering over what was left of the asphalt. The big man checked and rechecked the magnetic locks on the containers, moving almost mechanically, while the truck's radio picked up nothing but the dead, sanity-eroding hiss of static. The walls ahead were blocking everything, signal and hope alike. Their presence registered as a heavy, low-frequency drone vibrating somewhere at the base of the skull, turning the stomach. Veteran Hawks sat motionless, the back of his head resting against the cold cab partition. His old rifle, wrapped in worn camo tape, lay comfortably across his knees. The hunter from Montana had no use for the standard-issue Mjolnirs and their temperamental electronics. He trusted only what he'd personally tested in hundreds of skirmishes. His unsettling calm struck Tom as something almost supernatural, practically sacrilegious inside this rolling coffin. "Hey, Cassidy." The raspy, smoke-cured voice of Priya Nathan cut through the noise. The medic sat directly across from him, her hands moving fast and nervous as she sorted ampules in her bag. "Stop grinding your teeth. You'll wear them to powder before we even see the objects. No dentists on the other side." Tom forced his jaw open. His mouth tasted of burned plastic and copper. "I'm fine, Doc. Just the ride." "We're all just fine," Priya snapped, tucking another injector into her chest pocket. Her toxic sarcasm was the only medicine that still worked on this squad. "Heading out for a picnic." Except instead of sandwiches, we've got tungsten rods. And instead of sunshine, there's a dust screen that'll strip the skin off you in under a second. Dina Wallace stopped directly in front of Tom. She loomed over him like a wall, blocking the faint overhead light entirely. Without a word, the sergeant reached out and yanked the slack strap on his shoulder plate with crushing force. The webbing snapped taut and cracked. Tom felt the cold metal of the exoskeleton bite into his body, fusing with it. "Listen up, Cassidy." Wallace jerked him by the strap, forcing eye contact. "You flinch when the window opens, the wall hardens, and you're dead. And you take all of us with you. You understand me?" She slapped the side of his helmet with a heavy palm. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to knock the noise out of his head. It was an anchor gesture, dragging him back into the harsh reality of right now. "Yes, Sergeant," Tom ground out, feeling the fear drain into something blunt and heavy. He held his silence for a beat, then asked the question no one else would. "Sergeant, is it true the walls don't have command structure? That there's no way to stop them by taking out a leader?" The Oshkosh's diesel let out a tortured shriek as Garcia stood on the brakes. The soldiers were pitched forward. Metal clashed against exoskeleton and filled the hold. The heavy vehicle shuddered to a stop in a cloud of dust outside a looted gas station on Highway 400. Wallace turned her head slowly toward Cassidy. "Kill the leader, and it ends?" She said it so quietly, Tom had to lean in. "There's no head, kid. No command. The walls are a swarm. A single biological steamroller. Take out one section, the rest just steps over the wreckage. You're not fighting an enemy. You're trying to stop a landslide. We're just time." Priya Nathan gave a bitter little laugh over her ampules. "We're already dead, Tommy," she said flatly. "Just sandbags and a busted dam." In the silence that followed, Hawks's graveled voice came from the corner of the hold. "We're not going there to win," the veteran said. "We're going to be the door. Because somebody's got to stand in it." At that moment, Garcia's radio screamed. White noise blasted from the speaker, and then a long, blood-freezing rasp. "It's coming through the concrete! God, it just keeps moving! A sharp, wet sound cut the feed dead. Sato, pale as a sheet, stared at his tablet. "Captain Rodriguez, 3 miles north. 10 minutes ago there was a fortified position there. Now it's gone. 0. The wall's drone became almost physical, sending the water in their canteens into perfectly even ripples. Wallace drove her fist into the partition. "Floor it, Garcia! We're hitting the Augusta outskirts!" The truck surged forward. In the hold, the water in Cassidy's canteen shivered into fine, perfectly even ripples. The drone hit him in the diaphragm, and the ground outside lurched. Sato hammered data into his tablet. "Sergeant, thermal signatures are shifting. They're speeding up. The walls were moving at 3 miles an hour. Now it's almost 4.5. They can feel the river. They know we're heading for the bridge." Under the armor plates, his skin went cold and wet with sweat. 4.5 miles an hour. The speed of a fast, deliberate walk. The speed of a hunter who knows his prey has nowhere left to run and is simply closing the distance before the strike. "They're not just moving," Hawks murmured, watching the ruins of Augusta rise fast through the narrow gap between the armor panels. "They've started hunting. To them, we're just a heat signature on a plate." The drone became almost unbearable, turning into a physical pressure behind the eyes, making the world blur and lose color. Cassidy pressed his palms to his helmet, trying to stop the trembling in his skull, but the vibration was everywhere, in the air, in the truck's metal frame, in his own blood, which seemed to be coming to a boil. Ahead, the skeletal outlines of Augusta's buildings emerged from the gray dust. Above the collapsed high-rises, an impenetrable black wall of fog stood perfectly still. "Combat positions!" Wallace barked over the noise. "Check your coolant. Safety's off. We're entering the hot zone." Tom tightened his grip on the wet handle of the railgun. On the barrel, a red ready indicator blinked its warning. The capacitors answered with a thin, barely audible whine climbing toward ultrasound. He looked at his hands. His fingers weren't trembling anymore. They had simply gone completely numb, becoming part of the cold machinery of killing. The enemy had torn up the asphalt. Deep, ragged furrows ran all the way to the horizon, like scars on the body of an exhausted Earth. The Oshkosh swerved around the mangled wreckage of a combine harvester and groaned its way over a ripped-up slab of concrete. Cassidy nearly bit through his tongue, his mouth flooded with the taste of blood and metal. The cold, pitiless steel of the exoskeleton bit into his lower back, reminding him that he was nothing but a component now, a piece of the machine, locked inside gray polymer and hydraulics. Outside, through the narrow armor slit, stretched an endless graveyard of what had once been called civilization. The walls, vast accumulations of debris and organic matter, moved almost parallel to the highway, steadily overtaking the column. Where neat farmland had been, there was now a strip of gray dust and rubble. The front had ground brick houses and century-old trees into the dry soil, reducing everything to a homogeneous pulp. Farm equipment had been chewed up and spat out, leaving only shapeless heaps of rust. "Look at the fields," Hawk said, not pulling his eyes from his scope.
"That's what a mistake costs."
"Don't be stupid, Cassidy. Keep working while you still have hands." In the cramped troop compartment, the air smelled of burning rubber, overheated oil, and bitter sweat. Dust, fine as flour, filtered through the seals and clung to sweating faces, turning the soldiers into something like ghosts, frozen in place. Petrov, seated in the darkest corner, watched the others grimly. He understood what the rest were trying not to think about. They wouldn't have enough ammo. At the bridge, in that narrow bottleneck, the magazines would run dry too fast, turning their expensive weapons into useless clubs. The soldiers ran one last check on their ammo pouches, where the heavy tungsten rounds waited. Metal on metal filled the hold over the engine's roar. Everyone understood. Once the railguns started spitting slugs at hypersonic velocity, there'd be almost no time to reload. A second's hesitation here cost the whole team their lives. Sergeant Wallace grabbed the top rail and hauled herself up. Her armored glove tightened until the metal creaked. She was staring at the massive supports of Bridge 44, looming through the gray haze. In the dead light of a red indicator, the sergeant's face looked carved from stone. "Listen up!" Dina barked over the engine's grinding roar. 5 minutes to the point. The bridge is our only advantage. That bottleneck is everything. If we don't hold them there, they get into open ground. There are civilians on the other side. Thousands of people in Arkadelphia who haven't made it to the deep shelters yet. We're all they've got." She looked at Sato. The former IT guy, whose world 6 months ago had been nothing but code and server rooms, had a death grip on his ruggedized tablet. His fingers seemed fused to the touchscreen, where jagged graph lines crawled across the display. "Sato, distance?" the sergeant said shortly. "Thermal front at 2 miles, Sergeant." Sato didn't look up. His voice shook. "The walls are moving tight, closing faster than projected. If we don't get to position in the next few minutes, they'll pin us at the entrance. We won't have time to deploy." Wallace slammed her fist against the cab partition hard enough that the echo rang in everyone's ears. "Floor it, Garcia! Squeeze everything out of this bucket! Blow the engine if you have to!" The turbine shrieked at a pitch that edged toward ultrasound. The Oshkosh launched forward, literally vaulting the brakes in the road surface. The soldiers slammed into the hard benches. The exoskeleton hydraulics hissed as they took the impacts. The sticky, paralyzing terror in Cassidy's chest was slowly converting into something blunt and leaden. He drove a heavy magazine home into the railgun's receiver with a practiced movement. Dry, predatory click. The charge indicator blinked toxic green. "Priya?" Tom turned to the medic across from him. "You got anything in that bag for the shakes? My hands aren't cooperating." "I've got a bullet to the head," Priya said flatly, checking the clips on her medical bag. "Works fast and permanent. Grab your gun, Tommy, if you want to keep breathing. When it starts, the adrenaline takes over." The Oshkosh banked hard, tilting so far it almost scooped ground with its side armor. Roadside brush scraped across the hull with a shriek. Ahead, through a curtain of stirred dust, the cold gray water of the Arkansas River finally glinted. "Bridge in sight!" the driver cracked from the cab. "Coming into the drop zone!" "Everyone ready!" Wallace commanded, thumbing off her safety. "Hawks, first out. Take the tower, give us eyes. Cassidy, Miller, behind the concrete barriers on the right, crossfire coverage. Petrov, haul the crates to the pillbox and don't expose yourself. Move, move!" Tom stood up, his hydraulics whining as they amplified his movement. He was no longer quite human. He was a component in a defensive system, a component that was still, for now, alive. The ground under the wheels began to shake so hard his teeth knocked together. It wasn't the engine. It was the heavy, rhythmic, gut-deep drone of the approaching objects. The walls were close. They were breathing cold and death down the team's necks. "5 seconds!" Wallace yelled, grabbing the latch. "Brace!" At that moment, the truck lurched sideways. Garcia cranked the wheel all the way over, pitching the heavy vehicle into a ditch. The Oshkosh tipped, balanced on 2 wheels, and rolled onto its side with a deafening screech. "Get out!" Wallace ripped the jammed latch open. "Jump! Now!" Tom Cassidy dove for the exit behind Nathan. Miller kicked the ammo crate out ahead of him and followed. Cassidy's exoskeleton let out a grinding howl as he burst through into the gray murk, barely clearing the hydraulic frame as the vehicle crumpled around it. Boot hit concrete. His knees held only because of the hydraulics. Behind him came a deafening crack. The kinetic wave passed just over the ground, throwing up geysers of dust. The air turned scorching in an instant, flooding with the acrid stench of ozone. He turned. The Oshkosh had caught the fringe of a kinetic field strike. An invisible press had crushed the truck's rear section flat, but Garcia had gotten out of the cab a moment before impact. He lay in the dust, dazed but breathing. All 8 soldiers were on their feet. "Find cover!" Wallace raised her Mjolnir. "Spread out!" Tom sprinted for the concrete barriers. On his right, Miller in his massive hauler suit was already dragging the ammo crate, gouging deep trenches in the asphalt. The low-frequency drone plugged his ears. The ground trembled beneath him. Small stones began to bounce in place. From the ash-gray curtain, the objects emerged. 3 coal-black monoliths, seamless, featureless, with no visible joints or ports. They didn't walk. They seemed to glide, shredding and pulverizing the road surface through their mere presence. The air around them shimmered and warped with unbearable heat, a desert mirage effect. "Target's at 500 feet, Sato reported, eyes buried in his tablet, fingers visibly shaking. "Constant velocity. They're not slowing, Commander. They don't even register us." "Wait for the window!" Wallace cut him off, shouting over the rising drone. She pressed her shoulder into a cracked, cold bridge support. "Nobody fires without my command. Save your rounds. We don't get a second chance. Tom, cover the left sector. If even one of those things reaches the supports, the bridge comes down and we're done." Cassidy went prone behind a concrete barrier, his railgun's long barrel extended. 3 sharp black silhouettes pulsed in the digital scope. The charge indicator on the display climbed slowly, shifting from orange to a vivid green. The weapon's internal capacitors rose to a high, aching pitch, vibrating in his hands. Cold river air drifted up from below. The bridge's massive steel trusses hummed in the wind, resonating with the advancing objects. Hawks on the tower had gone still, the lead target centered in his optics. He was waiting for the heat dump moment, the instant the wall's field would briefly become vulnerable to kinetic impact. The monoliths were at 300 feet. The ancient dust under Cassidy's feet stirred in the vibration, lifting into the air. He had his firing grip locked on the control handle so tightly his knuckles ached, eyes fixed on the scope reticle. The walls kept closing, ignoring the terrain, ignoring the debris. The air around them sparked with static discharge, and small stones and fragments on the road began to rise slowly, caught in a gravitational distortion. The drone was nearly unbearable. It vibrated deep in the bones, pushing out every other sensation and thought, leaving only the ancient animal terror in the face of this faceless, unstoppable force. "Now!" The sergeant's voice cracked like a gunshot, snapping Tom out of his trance. "Fire at will! Hold your distance!" Cassidy pulled the trigger. A blinding flash burned his retinas for a moment. The tungsten rod, accelerated by the magnetic field to staggering velocity, struck dead center on the lead object and burst into thousands of white sparks against the invisible barrier. The walls didn't even rock. They kept their relentless advance. The fight for the bridge had started. The world vanished in a blinding white flash, followed by the hollow, ringing silence of a concussion. When his vision came back, Tom saw that the tungsten round, fired at maximum pressure, had burst into thousands of white sparks without leaving so much as a scratch on the enemy's matte biopolymer hull. The object hadn't just failed to slow down, it hadn't registered the hit at all. It kept its relentless advance, grinding what was left of the road surface beneath it with a low, gut-deep rumble that made bones vibrate. The monolith's kinetic field worked like an invisible hydraulic press of colossal force. The air in front of it rippled and warped, bending space into a heavy lens of kinetic shear. The dust it lifted off the ground didn't settle. It spun into wild vortices that traced the edges of the invisible shield, pulverizing stone and steel before the hull made physical contact. "Again!" Wallace snapped into the headset, and Tom heard in her normally iron voice nothing but cold, cutting fury. "Cassidy, aim for the base! Hawks, where the hell is the window?" Tom racked the mechanism with a frantic jerk, feeling the icy metal through his palm. The heavy Mjolnir railgun answered with a short, rising whine as its capacitors charged. His fingers inside the tight tactical gloves had gone completely numb from the constant ground tremor. The red rangefinder numbers and the narrow digital scope jumped uselessly, unable to lock onto the distorted surface of the target. The helmet's software interface kept throwing segmentation errors, unable to compute a trajectory through the kinetic lens. "Field's too dense!" Hawks's voice in the earpiece barely cut through the static crackle and the howling wind. "No heat dump! They're running in full seal mode! Every joule is going into the shield! If we don't punch through right now, They'll crush us along with the overpass. The ground beneath Tom's feet buckled like a living thing in agony. The concrete cover block they'd been using as shelter cracked, a web of deep fractures opening in it and bleeding thin streams of white dust. An invisible, crushing force compressed Tom's chest, knocking the remaining oxygen out of his lungs and turning his vision crimson. Every rib throbbed with an aching pain, as if someone were slowly tightening a vise around him. To his right, in the squat concrete pillbox at the bridge entrance, Sato was frantically slapping the tablet sensors with his palms, trying to retune the jamming frequency. His fingers slid across the cracked glass, leaving dirty smears. Beside him, Petrov, bent under the weight of a massive container of tungsten rods, was trying with shaking hands to lock the magnetic clamp onto the position's armored cupola. His face, drenched in sweat and coated in grime, was twisted with extreme effort, the veins in his neck standing out like taut cables. "Sergeant, they're shifting frequency again!" Sato shouted, and his cry had a crack in it that bordered on panic. "My drones are going blind! Losing the feed, the interface is drifting! They're adapting faster than I can enter the codes!" The lead wall glided forward, smooth as an iceberg in an open ocean. The kinetic wave, compressed to the density of a solid, hit the pillbox. The concrete walls, designed to take a direct tank round, crumbled inward in a fine spray as if they'd been made of dry sand. The thick steel rebar snapped with a sharp, brief ring like a pistol shot and vanished instantly into a cloud of debris. "Pull back!" Wallace screamed, throwing up a hand in a stopping gesture she knew no one would see. "Sato! Petrov! Get out of there right now! That's an order!" But it was already too late. The fortification collapsed like a cardboard box under a boot. The kinetic front erased concrete, iron, and electronics into a uniform gray powder. The object simply passed through, not altering its vector by a degree, not losing a single mile per hour. Tom watched in shock as Petrov froze for one moment in the breach, still clutching the heavy crate handle in a death grip. His exoskeleton screamed, trying to compensate for the unbearable load, and vented a short, hissing jet of white steam from its hydraulic relief valves. A second later, the multi-ton concrete roof slab, deprived of its support, came down directly on top of them, swallowing the men in a suffocating cloud of debris. Tom didn't hear the impact, his ears packed with cotton, and the world lost all meaning for a moment. A dense wave of concrete particles and fine granite chips washed over him, hammering painfully against his helmet visor and leaving a web of microscopic scratches. Red warning indicators flashed across his display in chaotic sequence. Critical vibration, acoustic trauma, comms failure. The helmet's interior filled with the shrill screaming of sensors reporting critical acoustic overload and ground seismic deformation. "Sato! Petrov! Answer up!" Dina's voice in the feed cracked to a rasp. She was demanding answers from dead men, refusing to accept the obvious. The earpieces held only the indifferent hiss of interference, through which came a barely audible rhythmic sound, possibly Wallace's own heartbeat. Where the pillbox had been a moment ago, there was now a flat layer of rubble. No screams, no blood, no sign of life. Only the acrid dust slowly settling over the smashed, torn-up asphalt like a shroud over a mass grave. "They're gone, Sergeant. North position completely destroyed," Hawks reported, his voice frighteningly flat. A robot reading a dry casualty brief. "Target vector is shifting toward you." Tom felt sick. Bile rose in his throat. Sato and Petrov were gone, erased from reality like an annoying pixel on a monitor, without registering resistance, without earning even a second's delay. "Cassidy!" Wallace grabbed his shoulder with an iron grip and shook him so hard his head knocked against the helmet padding. "Don't look over there. You hear me? Eyes on your sector. We need the window, Tom. Otherwise, all of this was for nothing." The sergeant raised her Mjolnir, pressing the stock into her shoulder. Her face, coated in a layer of white lime dust and streaked with sweat, looked like a frozen mask, jaw clamped shut. Her eyes burned with a cold, inhuman fire. "They're almost at the bridge." Dina jabbed her barrel toward the second wall, which was already making its final approach, splitting the space ahead with its massive hull. "If we don't stop them right now, they walk over our bodies to the civilian shelters. Thousands of people, Tom. Thousands of people who don't know how to shoot." A second kinetic wave, weaker but still devastating, ripped a huge chunk of road less than 15 feet from them. The deep crater exposed rusted, mangled underground pipes that hissed with escaping steam and dirty water. The air became unbearably dry and hot, smelling of burned wiring, ozone, and scorched rock. Static electricity raised the hairs on Tom's arms, even through the thick undersuit fabric. "Hawks, sector!" Wallace barked again, not turning around. "Report the flanks." "Targets in the engagement zone," the sniper answered, and for the first time in the entire operation, there was something alive and strained in his voice. "Sergeant, look at the lead wall. The field is unstable. It's overloaded from absorbing the pillbox debris." Tom hauled the railgun up, wiping the dust from his visor with a shaking hand. Directly ahead, no more than 50 yards away, the lead wall kept its heavy advance. But the air around it had suddenly begun twisting into a tight, howling funnel. The low drone gave way to a piercing ultrasonic whistle as the object's kinetic field compressed to incredible density, bracing for its final, most devastating strike against the bridge supports. Tom Cassidy pressed himself into the broken concrete so hard he felt the sharp edges of the exoskeleton's steel plates cutting into his ribs through the damper layer. His mouth was full of the grit of fine rubble, mixed with the metallic taste of copper. The ground vibration had become a continuous, sanity-destroying drone that ran through the entire body from heel to skull. The surface under his stomach shuddered in a rapid, pounding rhythm against his armor like a berserk metronome. The inside of his helmet filled with the acrid smell of burning insulation and overheated refrigerant. The cooling systems choked, venting excess heat through dust-clogged radiators with a strained wail. Tom clenched his teeth until his jaw ached. The internal grinding in his own ears seemed louder for a moment than the rumble of the approaching monolith erasing the city. He felt like an insect under the heel of a god. "Cassidy!" Wallace's voice in the earpiece, distorted by interference, barely cut through the crash of a collapsing building nearby. "Come on, grunt! Second target incoming! Don't let it build speed!" He snapped his head to the side, smearing sweat across his face against the helmet's inner padding. The image still pulsed in his memory. The concrete pillbox where Sato and Petrov had sheltered, gone, replaced by a flat patch of gray rubble. Cold anger, slow and viscous, pushed out the sticky fear. Tom gripped the fire control handle until it hurt, feeling the weapon become an extension of his hands. The railgun's coils rose shrieking toward ultrasound, making his teeth ache and his temples throb. The second wall was at 80 yards. It moved along the shredded highway like a colossal iron pressing its way through the world, leaving behind a deep furrow of ripped-up asphalt and pulverized drainage slabs. The powerful kinetic field around it shimmered and shifted with oily patterns, turning the bridge's outlines into a wavering mirage in which logic and perspective ceased to exist. "Hawks, I can't punch it!" Tom shouted, watching the targeting reticle skitter helplessly across the mirror matte surface of the object. "Field's too dense! Ricochet guaranteed! Impact angle is completely wrong!" "Wait," the sniper replied. His voice was dry and flat, like the sound of a nail being driven into a coffin. "It's overheating from the load. Too much mass in the way. It'll vent ballast any second now to bleed off pressure. Catch the moment. You'll have a fraction of a second." Tom held his breath and nearly stopped blinking, ignoring the dust burning his eyes. The charge indicator on the edge of his display pulsed toxic green, signaling critical energy accumulation in the magnetic rails. The veins in his temples swelled. Colored spots drifted across his vision. At the center of the coal-black monolith, where the surface had been perfectly smooth, a convulsion ran through it. The heavy biopolymer rippled with a sickening, tar-like shimmer. The black mass began to melt, exposing its technological innards, and deep within it, a crimson pupil flared. The energy dump point. "Window!" Wallace barked over the wind and the groan of metal. 3 seconds! Hit it, Cassidy, or we all die here!" The world around him instantly collapsed to the size of a digital scope reticle. The ruins ceased to exist. The smoke, the bodies of his teammates, the sergeant's shouts, gone. It was only that pulsing crimson point at the center of the chaos. 3. He pressed the trigger smoothly, the way the training range had drilled into him 10,000 times, taking up the slack. His heart froze in anticipation. 2. The capacitors behind him screamed one final time, pushing to peak power on the edge of self-destruction. A bright arc of a short circuit flared at the external contacts, bathing the concrete rubble around him in a dead, blue-white light. 1. Impact. The massive stock drove into his shoulder with tremendous force, nearly dislocating the joint and cracking his collarbone through the damper. The exoskeleton hydraulics clanged hard, absorbing the recoil, but Tom was still thrown backward a good 6 feet. The supersonic crack of the shot literally knocked the air from his lungs, leaving a hollow, ringing cavity in his chest. The 8-inch tungsten rod tore through the air, leaving behind a brilliant, glowing contrail of ionized atmosphere. It entered at the exact geometric center of the crimson patch, piercing the defense at the moment of its greatest vulnerability. The wall shuddered through its entire massive body. From the deep breach, as if from a wound, orange fire erupted mixed with chunks of superheated polymer. The defensive field burst with a sharp, dry crack like tearing canvas, deafening everyone within 100 yards. Chunks of burning, ichor-weeping organic matter crashed onto the bridge spans, making the steel supports groan and bow. "Got it!" Tom didn't recognize his own voice. It was the hoarse, triumphant cry of a man who had just looked into the abyss and managed to wound it, to prove it could bleed. "Don't relax, kid!" Wallace was already beside him, her boots crunching through broken glass. She grabbed him by the shoulder plate with an iron grip and hauled him to his feet despite the shaking in his knees. "That was only the first line."
"Hawks, what's on the horizon?"
"Clear for maybe a minute," the veteran reported, and for the first time, real tension cut through his voice. "But we have a critical problem on the left flank. Miller, report status. Now!" Tom turned heavily, fighting off rising dizziness and nausea. Corporal Miller stood 10 yards away, locked inside the massive steel frame of the hauler suit. The huge engineering exoskeleton was frozen in a bizarre, canted pose, like a shot beetle. From the knee and hip joints came thick jets of white steam mixed with an oily liquid, hissing like a snake. "Seized up!" Miller wrenched his whole body, and the metal of the suit answered with a grinding, shredding moan that drove into the eardrums. "Right drive is totally dead. Sand in the gearbox. Every indicator is red. I can't move, Sergeant. I'm bolted to the goddamn asphalt." "Blow the magnetic locks, Miller. Quit playing statue," Priya Nathan shouted, wincing from the pain in her wounded thigh as she climbed over sharp concrete debris toward the corporal. Her helmet was cracked, and a thin, bright trickle of blood ran down her cheek and disappeared inside her collar. "The locks are arc-welded shut from the hit." Miller was jerking at the emergency release levers with bone-cracking force, but the heavy armor held him in a dead, suffocating grip. "Sergeant, I'm trapped! It won't go! Hydraulics are empty!" Tom saw new silhouettes beginning to emerge from the dense gray dust on the horizon. More of them. Far more than the first wave. 5, 7, 10 black monoliths forming a perfect line, slowly and inexorably sealing off the full width of the highway from edge to edge. And they were accelerating, building inertia for a final charge. The low-frequency drone returned, boring through to the gut, making the internal organs vibrate in step with the enemy's advance. It was louder now, heavier, angrier. The ground was trembling under his boots again, heralding the start of a new, far more powerful kinetic wave that would leave nothing standing of the overpass. "Help me!" Miller shouted again. He was struggling uselessly inside his seized armor, his cry full of primal terror. But Wallace said nothing. She understood there was no time to crack the locks, and any rescue attempt would finish off what was left of the squad. The lead wall of the second wave passed through the corporal's position without breaking stride, as if he were an empty tin can. Miller had just enough time to get one short, filthy curse out over the open channel before the multi-ton steel frame and the man inside it were ground into the pavement, pressed flat. Machine and human turned into a shapeless smear. The air above the highway burst from the kinetic pulse. Priya reacted before Tom had even processed another teammate's death. Her fingers, rigid and cold as steel clamps, dug into his shoulder, and in the next instant, the world turned upside down again. She yanked him down so hard Tom's teeth clicked and his vision went dark. Gravel and broken glass sprayed under their boots as they dropped into a concrete gap, a narrow, damp-smelling, old dust fissure that had opened at the joint of two collapsed overpass slabs. In the same instant, directly above their heads, came an enormous impact that shook the foundations of reality itself. The heavy road sign that had been hanging from a single bolt a moment ago didn't merely fall, it was annihilated. The metal turned into a fine gray aerosol that settled in a dense cloud over the edges of their temporary shelter. Microscopic particles of aluminum and paint filled the space, packing into nostrils and scraping the throat with a caustic, toxic chemical bite. Priya dragged Tom deeper into the gap, away from the open sky. She was wheezing, ragged and heavy, her lungs packed with concrete dust. She had a death grip on his jacket, her other arm clutching the heavy, angular medical bag, as if it were the only anchor in a collapsing world. In the half-dark, her dilated pupils shone with a feverish gleam, reflecting the red glow of the helmet's emergency indicators. "Easy," Tom tried to whisper, but his own voice seemed alien to him, small and impossibly distant in the tightness of this space. Priya only pressed him harder into the corner, ordering silence with her entire body. From outside, from the world above, came the murmur of settling dust and a strange, unmistakable drone that made the gut clench with pain. The concrete gap that had become their shelter seemed unreliable. Thin cracks ran down the walls, widening with each new impact from the walls outside, and fine grit sifted down from above, warning of a possible collapse. The air was stifling, smelling of charred materials, antiseptic, and fear. Priya held still, listening to the silence outside that was more frightening than any roar. The bag, wedged between them, felt like the only valuable thing in the universe right now, the only justification for being here. Tom closed his eyes and tried to match his ragged breathing to her whistling wheeze. They were trapped, but as long as the bag was intact, they had a reason to breathe this dust. The memory surfaced. The truck's troop compartment 3 hours ago. The overloaded engine's thunder, the smell of burning insulation, and a crimson half-dark where his teammates' faces had looked like demon masks. Of those who had started this ride in clean uniforms with full magazines, almost none were unharmed now. Tom remembered the white-knuckled grip on his rifle, afraid of coming apart from the sheer vibration of the vehicle. Wallace had stood in the middle of the lurching truck, checking equipment with a stone-faced, expressionless stare. She hadn't looked at them. Her gaze was already there, over the line, in the kill zone.
The truck had been hammering through ruts, Miller coughing in a cloud of steam from a cracked radiator, still alive and full of hope. Tom had looked at his own shaking hands and hadn't recognized them. 9 days ago, he'd been fixing a tractor in Wichita, wiping his hands on an oily rag. Now he was expendable shock material, a bolt in an enormous meat grinder. The wall's low drone had already been chewing through the truck's armor into his skull back then, causing nausea and a deep animal dread. Priya had been sorting her ampules, telling Tom not to chew his teeth or he'd grind them to powder. Wallace had yanked him by the armor strap, driving in one idea: flinch at the transition moment, and everyone dies. That cry of desperation Tom had made diving into the wall's ashen haze still rang in his ears as a phantom echo, reminding him there was no going back. Blood dripped into an empty, still warm shell casing at her feet, making a faint metallic ring. Dina Wallace sat on a chipped concrete block in the corner of an abandoned machine shop, feeling a thick, sticky trickle running down her left temple. She didn't wipe it. The hand gripping the rifle felt like it was full of lead, and her fingers were numb from the Mjolnir's brutal recoil. The air held a suffocating mix of burned electronics, ozone, rust, and old rags. In 22 minutes of fighting, time had turned into thick, gray sludge. Every breath scorched the lungs with dust. The soldiers had frozen where the brief lull had caught them, on the floor, against battered partition walls, sheltering under collapsed machinery. Only Wallace held her back straight, the single reference point in the chaos, the steel rod the remnants of the squad were holding themselves up by. "Ammo count," Dina ordered hoarsely, struggling to focus on her people. Her voice came out wrong, cracked, as if she'd been yelling into a void for a long time. "2 tungsten rods," Hawks answered. He'd worked through the whole fight like a metronome. Shot, coolant swap, shot again. His voice came from above now, from the tangle of steel trusses under the roof. A dry click. The sniper was checking his magazine, more from habit than from any hope of finding a spare round. "In the last coolant pack. If the barrels overheat again, they'll just melt in our hands. Useless scrap." Hawks shifted almost imperceptibly,
and dust sifted down from the beams onto the mangled remains of equipment below. His silhouette in the camo shroud nearly merged with the rust-red framework of the shop, making him a ghost standing watch over their brief rest. "Hold pressure on it, or he bleeds out right here!" Priya's sharp shout made Tom flinch and surface from his daze. In the dim light at the far wall, the medic was finishing up with Chips Garcia. The comm specialist leaned against cold concrete, breathing in heavy, whistling pulls through a punctured lung. His face was pale, nearly gray under the soot, but his eyes were open, burning with feverish pain and stubbornness. Priya worked fast and focused, her movements polished to automatic by years of practice in field hospitals. Her gloved fingers moved with mechanical precision, despite the fine trembling in her hands from exhaustion. The passage behind them was sealed by the explosion. In the narrow corridor throat lay the bodies, a pile of mangled meat, armor fragments, and chunks of biopolymer they'd accumulated in those endless 20 minutes of fighting. It was their only protection, their improvised berm, but now that same barrier had turned them into hostages, cutting off all retreat. There was no way out. The walls of the old factory pressed in from all sides, turning the position into a concrete coffin where the last traces of hope were slowly dying. "Barely enough ammo to shoot ourselves," Priya said, yanking the knot tight on the bandage, making Garcia involuntarily yelp and clench his teeth. She raised her head, and in her eyes Dina saw the same dark irony that had always kept the medic sane through the worst hours. "Next time, Sergeant, we'll throw empty aid kits at them. Or just spit. They say the adrenaline in our blood right now is more toxic than any poison. That's our last resource." Garcia tried to smile and produced instead a tortured moan that he immediately suppressed. His fingers clenched spasmodically around the body of the portable radio on his belt, the last thread connecting them to command. Dina slowly forced her body upright, fighting its resistance. Her knees shook treacherously, and bright sparks flashed behind her eyes for a moment. She walked to the edge of a breach in the wall and looked out to where the city had once been. The distant horizon, already obscured by haze, had vanished entirely behind a dense curtain of rising ash. The approach of the next wave was tactile. The air had grown thick and charged, and the factory floor had begun to tremble faintly underfoot, as if from the tread of a colossal beast coming for them. In the silence of the abandoned shop, Garcia's belt radio suddenly crackled, a burst of static that made everyone flinch. The sound was as sharp as a knife striking glass. Through the interference came a mechanical, emotionless voice from the bunker dispatcher. He read out their call sign clearly, listed coordinates, and confirmed what they had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. No reinforcements. They were the last line. The lull was over. Dina shifted her rifle to a better grip, feeling the blood on her temple starting to dry and pulling at her skin with an unpleasant tightening. Ahead was only darkness and a last fight no one came back from. She looked over her surviving people. Hawks, motionless in the shadows above. Priya, bent over the wounded. Cassidy, stretched out against the rubble. And Garcia, who was using the last of himself trying to sit straight. They were ready.
They were all that stood between the walls and whoever was hiding below.
"Combat positions," she said quietly, and that whisper in the dead silence of the factory rang louder than any shout, closing the door on their past and opening the one that led to the inevitable. Garcia's radio rasped, spitting a burst of sharp static that seemed to physically rake across the soldiers' taut nerves. It wasn't just noise. In the wall's distortion field, radio waves turned into something tangible, audio shrapnel hammering the eardrums. Through the white noise and the pulsing interference came the dispatcher's voice. It was dry, mechanical, stripped of even a trace of human sympathy. Not a person, but a looping algorithm. Cassidy jerked, nearly dropping the heavy magazine for his rifle. His fingers, numb from cold and vibration, barely responded. The sharp sound cut through the low-frequency, sanity-shredding drone of the walls that had been vibrating in his bones for the last 12 hours. The drone had not stopped for a single second. It filtered through active noise earpieces, through helmets and skulls, making teeth ache and thoughts congeal into a sticky mass. Grunt 7, this is Command. Confirm object status and perimeter integrity. Over. Wallace raised the handset slowly, as if fighting through thick syrup. Her hand in the heavy tactical glove, coated in a layer of gray dust and powder residue, paused for a moment. The sergeant wasn't in any hurry. She was looking through the cracked, web-fractured visor at what was left of their forward element. Below, at the bridge entrance, the burning hulks of armored vehicles were finishing their slow death. Thick black smoke rose straight up, not blown by wind, but pulled as if by the wall's invisible press. The vein in her neck, just below the dirty collar of her Kevlar balaclava, pulsed with a feverish rhythm. Every heartbeat hammered in her temples like a heavy mallet, counting down the seconds of their remaining lives. Grunt 7 on, the sergeant finally said. Her voice, through the vocoder, came out surprisingly steady, despite the blood dried on her lips and the terrible thirst that had turned her throat into sandpaper.
Object secured. Bridge under full fire control. 50% casualties. Sato, Petrov, Miller, KIA. Remaining personnel have injuries of varying severity. Ammunition almost gone. Awaiting immediate order to withdraw.
A pause filled the air. It lasted impossibly long, filled only by the distant, muffled thunder of heavy artillery and the whistle of wind through the bridge's mangled rebar, singing its own funeral song. Priya Nathan, wedged into a corner behind a stack of crates marked "Flammable," tossed an empty injector. It clinked dully against the concrete and rolled to rest against a pile of spent shell casings. The medic's face was coated in gray, sticky grime, streaked with lighter tracks of dried sweat. She didn't look up, continuing to stare blankly at her own trembling fingers, the fingers that had just tried to stitch a ragged wound in Cassidy's side.
Negative, Grunt 7. Receive new orders.
The dispatcher's voice went colder, acquiring a metallic clang.
Hold current position for 4 additional hours. Heavy armored column from command group departed sector B4 and is moving in your direction. Reserve arrival and evacuation unit scheduled for 0400. Confirm receipt.
4 hours. Cassidy swallowed convulsively, feeling a dry, prickling lump rise in his throat. He looked down at his gear spread on a piece of tarp. His ammo pouch held exactly 2 tungsten rods, the last 2 arguments against eternity. The Mjolnir barrels on the automated turrets were still noticeably hot, radiating the heavy smell of overheated metal and burned lubricant. His armor's exoskeleton, hit and damaged in 3 places, no longer helped him move. It only pulled him down, turning into an unwieldy steel coffin with no exit. Acknowledged, Command. Say again. Acknowledged. Holding object until 0400. Wallace released the handset with such force it snapped out of the clip and swung back on its coiled cord like a pendulum on a doomsday clock.
The sergeant turned slowly to face her team. She wanted to say something encouraging, maybe professionally lie that 4 hours was nothing, that they'd manage. But the words lodged in her throat. Garcia, their comms man, the youngest in the squad, sat gripping his tablet in both hands, knuckles white. His right eyelid twitched in a fine, rapid rhythm, and his dilated, nearly black pupils reflected the scrolling lines of code he was trying to decrypt in defiance of every security protocol. "Sergeant," Garcia's voice cracked to a rasp. He coughed, spitting dark, thick saliva onto the floor. "Sergeant, I caught a fragment of an encrypted message. This isn't our protocol. Parallel short-range channel cutting straight through the wall's interference. Command group IFF codes. Second strike element is requesting confirmation of fire on the grid square." Dina Wallace snapped upright instantly, shedding exhaustion like old skin. She took a step toward the comms man, looming over the flickering screen that bathed her face in a sick blue light. At the same moment, from somewhere above, from the half-collapsed flooring of the technical level where the observation point was, Hawks dropped down. His landing was heavy, lacking its usual cat-like grace. The soldier's face was a mask of dust and dried crust, his arms coated to the elbow in someone else's blood that had already gone dark. He said nothing. He simply walked to the metal table buried under maps, empty casings, and strips of bandage, and slowly opened his fist. A burned military dog tag dropped onto the cold metal surface with a soft, ominous ring. One that didn't belong to anyone in their squad. Hawks looked at Wallace. In his hollow, burned-out eyes, she read the same thing Garcia had seen on the screen. The waiting time had collapsed to 0. Tom Cassidy gripped his Mjolnir's forend again. To keep his teeth from betraying his fear, he clenched his jaw until his temples ached, tasting in his mouth the metallic bite of stale air and his own blood. Hawks didn't move. In the uneven, pulsing light of the emergency lamps, he looked like an ancient statue, frozen in anticipation of inevitable collapse. He stared at the sergeant directly, and in his dilated pupils, the distant fires that had consumed the suburbs flickered and danced. "The column isn't coming," Hawks said. His voice was remarkably even, nearly lifeless, stripped of any emotional inflection. "It was destroyed in Sector B4 an hour ago. I found a scout in the drainage channel under the 4th support. He took a long time dying, drowning in blood inside his breached pressure helmet. He had time to talk before his heart stopped." The room became unbearably quiet. The only sound was the strained whistling of Garcia's clogged helmet filter. The rising, low-frequency vibration of the walls made loose screws on the control board dance with a thin, maddening rattle that sounded like insect laughter. Sergeant Wallace didn't move. She kept staring at the dog tag, as if trying to read on the scorched metal the brief and inglorious account of her near future. Her fingers in the heavy, scratched glove dragged slowly across the edge of the table, gathering a layer of gray dust like the ash of burned hopes. "They knew," Garcia breathed, not looking at the screen where the red target markers had begun converging on a single point. "Command knew from the start there was no relief coming. They confirmed coordinates 5 minutes ago. Dina, the airstrike isn't targeted at the walls. It's targeted at the bridge. Right at us." Priya flung the bloody, sticky bandage to the floor. She snarled, baring her teeth in an expression that was almost animal. "Bait!" she spat, and the word hung in the air, heavy and airless as lead.
We're goddamn live bait. They're waiting for the objects to mass here in a tight cluster so they can take them all out with a single tactical airstrike. We're not a blocking force, Wallace. We're just a beacon, a target designator they're swinging the hammer at. Priya stepped toward Wallace, her steel-toed boots clanging hard on the ribbed floor, striking sparks. She grabbed the sergeant's exoskeleton shoulder plate roughly, trying to force her to look into eyes full of fury and despair. You knew? The usual toxic sarcasm in Priya's voice was still there, but now it struck without mercy, without pulling the punch. Tell me, Dina, you knew they left us here to rot and burn alive for the sake of some headquarters statistic? For a successful containment report? Wallace raised her head slowly. Her gaze was utterly empty, burned out as if after a nuclear flash. She moved the medic's hand aside with a gentle but absolute motion, apparently requiring no effort at all. My job is to hold this objective, the sergeant said precisely, and there wasn't a single shade of doubt in her voice, only bitter resolution. The order hasn't changed. Everything else is noise. This is suicide! Cassidy stepped forward. His exoskeleton let out a pitiful shriek from the damaged drive, throwing sparks from under the knee joint. Wallace, we need to go. Right now, while there's still 300 yards of gap. If we move west through the low ground, there's a chance we can lose them in the terrain features. Go where? Hawks cut him off, without even turning toward his teammate. Behind us is open, flat ground with no cover for 6 miles. The walls are running a wide front. They're blocking every horizon and distorting the terrain. They'll crush us in the open in 5 minutes. At least here we've got this concrete and steel. Here we can at least bite back before we die. Hawks walked to the shattered window and pressed his hot, sweaty forehead against the cold frame. Outside, Kansas was drowning in a dense gray murk that seemed alive. The horizon pulsed with crimson flashes, objects shedding heat before a final charge, turning the air into shimmering haze. The air inside the room had gone dry and acrid, smelling of burned insulation, ozone, and scorched rock. So that's it? Garcia whispered, staring at his tablet's flickering display, where 3 huge red dots were inexorably converging on their position, swallowing the space between them. We just stand here and wait for them to drop a couple tons of napalm on our heads? Wallace walked silently to Tom. With a short, precise movement, she pulled one of the 2 remaining tungsten rods from his open pouch. With a dry, heavy clang, she drove it into the receiver of her heavy railgun. The action chambered the round with a clank, a sound in the silence like a final verdict with no appeals process. We're buying them time, she said, looking toward the river invisible behind the smoke. There are 7,000 people in the Arkadelphia shelters, mostly civilians, kids, elderly. If the bridge goes down before the objects mass on this bank, they won't stop. They'll wade across downstream, straight into the residential sectors. This way, the aircraft takes them all right here. The shaking in Tom's hands abruptly stopped, replaced by a strange, cold calm that comes to a person when there is absolutely nothing left to lose. He understood. They were expendable. Surplus components in an enormous and pitiless war machine that ran on their blood. Priya Nathan was methodically, almost mechanically, packing the remaining ampules into her field bag. Her hands worked cleanly and steadily. The old habit of a field surgeon wouldn't let them shake even now, on the threshold of extinction. She was muttering something angry and indistinct under her breath, mixing dark medical humor with choice profanity in 3 languages. 4 hours, Hawk said, clicking through his scope settings. We need to hold till 0400,
then the sky lights up, for us and for them, and it'll be the brightest thing we've ever seen. The approaching wall's drone had grown so powerful and so low that the old floor underfoot began to crumble into dust. Deep cracks ran through the walls under the flaking paint. Tom raised his Mjolnir and checked the charge level. The indicator glowed a steady green. He had stopped being a person trying to survive. He was just a functional node in this enormous steel trap. Beyond the dense dust curtain, somewhere high above, the turbines of heavy bombers roared to life. Command had no intention of waiting a single extra second. They'd strike the bridge, enemy and their own people together, turning an act of courage into a dry line in a report. Cassidy yanked the cord, feeling the tension transmit through his shoulder. The spool's edges cut into his palm, even through the reinforced glove fabric, leaving deep grooves in the polymer. The line reeked of harsh chemicals, a mix of chlorine and old plastic that made his eyes water and his throat itch. He wound loop after loop around the steel support, trying to ignore how the metal vibrated under his feet. The bridge was shaking as if in a fever. The fine tremors rose from the deck through his knees, making his joints ache.
Wind it tighter, Cassidy. We don't need that thing slipping when the heat starts,
Wallace barked, passing him on her way to the platform's edge. The sergeant was shouldering a heavy crate of thermite mix marked with bright red stripes. Her hauler model exoskeleton creaked with every step, hydraulics running at the limit, pushing pistons with a dry, grinding sound. The suit's joints were chewing up whatever grit had gotten into the articulations, grinding it to gray dust. Wallace didn't stop and didn't look back. She was watching only the west, where in the deepening dusk, the enemy's heat dump flares were lighting up, one after another, in a toxic orange. The sky there looked dirty, coated in char and smoke, as if the atmosphere itself had begun to rot. Tom pulled the last knot tight, feeling his fingers go completely numb from cold and strain. He pressed his palm to the cold truss, trying to suppress the internal trembling that was stronger than the bridge's vibration. 30 feet below, the Arkansas was hammering the concrete piers. The river had turned into a torrent of liquid tar, carrying dark foam and debris downstream, whatever upstream had once been a functioning city. Cold wind off the water burned his face, bringing the smell of river mud, rust, and an approaching storm. "Get over here, Cassidy, now! You look like you're about to go over the rail." Priya Nathan called to him from where she'd leaned her back against a crash barrier, mangled by impacts. She looked wrecked, eyes sunken, but her hands weren't shaking. She was pulling 5 gray plastic cylinders from her tactical bag, glinting dully in the dying daylight. Inside each one, auto-injector needles waited. The medic worked with disturbing speed, movements drilled to automatic by thousands of repetitions on training mannequins and living humans. She drove an injector directly into her own wounded thigh through the tear in her pants. She didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. Only her pupils dilated instantly to fill her eyes, turning her face into the mask of something foreign and predatory. "Adrenaline and Class 3 neuromimic," Priya said, handing an injector to Tom. Her voice had become strangely flat, stripped of all emotion. "It'll push your heart to the limit. Reaction speed doubles. Otherwise, you just won't keep up with their fields." "Your brain has to run faster than their sensors. Inject now while the blood's still warm."
Tom took the cold plastic, feeling its strange, almost unreal weight.
Side effects?
He asked quietly, staring at the needle that was about to inject artificial rage into his bloodstream. You die, Cassidy. Either an aortic rupture or the crash an hour from now when your nervous system just burns out. Priya showed her teeth in something that might have been a smile. But that's later. Right now, inject when they come at us. This is your only one-way ticket. Enjoy the last ride. High above them, Hawks was climbing the narrow steel rungs toward the very top of the pylon. The heavy rifle on his back seemed like a part of his own body, an extension of bones and muscle. The veteran didn't look back or down. He froze on a narrow maintenance platform, literally merging with the steel and the shadows. His silhouette dissolved against the darkening sky, leaving only a barely perceptible ghost gleam from the optics. Cassidy knelt at the junction box, bringing the detonator contacts together. The copper wires seemed thin and fragile to him, like spider silk. Sergeant, perimeter's set. Charges are armed. If they push too hard, I blow the first section. Cuts off our retreat, but holds them on the far side. There's no retreat, Cassidy. Wallace checked her railgun's charge level. A chain of blue indicators ran across the weapon's body, like the glowing eyes of a monster. Behind us is just open ground and the strike zone. We're here to bring them to a single point, and we're going to make this trap snap shut, no matter what it costs us. Tom returned to his Mjolnir in the deep shadow of a support. He checked the magnetic locks on the shoulder plates, making sure the composite sat tight without restricting movement. The armor pressed down on his shoulders, a familiar weight that today felt crushing, as if he were carrying the mass of the entire world. The air around had dried out completely. Char and ozone drifted in, a sure sign that the space in front of the bridge was beginning to ionize, preparing for the breach. On the horizon, breaking through the remnants of a tree line, the wall monoliths rose. More than 10 enormous, geometrically perfect shadows that looked carved from the void itself. They moved in silence, but the ground under the bridge had begun to web with deep cracks, as if it couldn't tolerate their alien presence. The asphalt split with dry pops that sounded like gunshots. "Positions!" Wallace's voice carried across the bridge, amplified by the exoskeleton's external speakers, cutting over the fierce roar of the river and the groan of deforming metal. Cassidy pressed the stock to his shoulder, merging with the weapon, making it part of himself. In the digital scope, the world transformed instantly. Twilight vanished, replaced by a sharp, high-contrast green spectrum. He could see every crack on the surfaces of the approaching objects, every curl of the thermal wake they left behind. The sky above had turned crimson, filling with the color of dried blood. The monolith walls were beginning to shed their stored heat, and the air above them trembled. The first kinetic wave struck the bridge supports. The steel screamed like a living thing caught in a death trap. Cassidy froze into a statue. The finger on the trigger felt every micrometer of the mechanism's travel. Hawks on the pylon made a slight adjustment, hunting for the vulnerability point. The first wall reached the deck, and the bridge lurched beneath it with a groan of deforming metal. "Hold the line!" Wallace called again. Her massive exoskeleton-clad figure had frozen in the narrow gap between concrete blocks, becoming part of the improvised barricade. The earth shuddered with a heavy, gut-level vibration, and Tom Cassidy felt the first warm trickle from his left nostril. He barely held on to the slippery injector as the plunger went home with a dry, almost clerical click into the tight muscle of his shoulder. The drug hit his blood instantly,
carrying fire through his veins. First came an icy cold that pushed out the fear, and then a scorching heat. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird throwing itself against its cage. His vision became unnaturally sharp, the edges of objects gaining razor clarity, colors fading to steel, lifeless shades. Tom heard everything. Inside his helmet, the oxygen delivery system worked with its measured, calming hiss. He heard Priya Nathan's unsteady, panicked breathing 10 yards behind him. She was grinding her teeth, trying to stop the trembling in her hands. He heard Leroy Hawks high above on the icy steel truss, exhaling slowly and deliberately in a sniper's controlled breath, freezing before the decisive shot. Every move Tom made had become light, almost weightless, as if gravity had temporarily loosened its grip, giving him one last chance. His fingers rested on the forend, feeling no weight from the weapon. What he held in his hands was a heavy, gun oil and overheated plastic-smelling piece of death. "Here they come," Cassidy said, barely recognizing his own voice. It had gone low and alien in the comm system, stripped of human inflection. The first wall slid onto the deck. Under the colossal weight, concrete became powder instantly. The kinetic field crumpled the steel guardrails into knots. The air swam with heat distortion, and the burst asphalt sprayed stone chips like shrapnel. The old bridge screamed like a living thing in agony. The metal of the load-bearing trusses groaned under stresses no engineer of the past had ever designed for, resonating with the low-frequency drone of the enemy. Far below, in the permanent shadow of the structure, dead black water lay still, reflecting only the gray ruins of civilization and a dying sky.
"Brace for heat dump." Sergeant Wallace's voice on the channel was completely free of emotion. It had become part of the general mechanical noise, as cold as the helmet's interface. "Hawks, left flank is yours. Cassidy, take center. Wait for the window. Do not fire into the field. Save your energy." Tom pressed into the scope. The wall pulsed crimson, prepping its discharge. The object's polymer shell was flowing open, exposing a weave of meat-thick cables and pulsing conduits. In the center, a vertical slit opened, flooded with a blinding alien light. "Now!" Wallace's shout was the signal for the beginning of the end. Cassidy pressed the trigger smoothly on the exhale. The rifle didn't fire. It barked, releasing the energy stored in the capacitors. The savage recoil shoved his shoulder, but the exoskeleton's servos boomed as they absorbed the strike, driving Tom's boots into the concrete. The tungsten rod, driven by magnetic fields to 5 times the speed of sound, tore through the air, leaving a glowing, ozone-reeking contrail behind it. The round entered the pulsing light slit dead center. The wall shuddered as if struck by the hammer of an invisible god. From the deep breach, something white, thick, and phosphorescent sprayed outward. A blinding flash burned out the helmet's optical sensors for a moment, leaving bright spots on the retinas. The kinetic field burst with a deafening crack, blasting out the last surviving windows and the abandoned vehicles on the bridge. The enormous hull toppled sideways, tearing up the asphalt layer, punching through the deck, and dragging tons of mangled concrete into the void below. But Tom felt no triumph. No relief came. The emptiness in his chest only went deeper. He slowly raised his eyes from the scope and looked at the horizon, blanketed in a dense pall of char. The sky above the city had gone completely black. From the smoke and ash, slowly and inexorably, new shadows emerged. Dozens, hundreds of the same monoliths. They sealed off the horizon,
turning the world into a geometry of darkness and pain. The bridge shook underfoot, vibrating under the tread of an entire army against which their tiny squad was nothing but a handful of dust thrown in the face of a hurricane. Dead in 5 minutes, Priya gripped her medical bag strap, her voice cracking to a rasp. Hope at least hell has better food than basic training. Garcia, standing a little apart, was frantically working his radio, watching the approaching crimson glow. In his dilated pupils sat the primal, paralytic terror that no drug could silence. Sergeant Dina Wallace stepped forward onto the most exposed stretch of the bridge, directly into the advancing storm. Her massive, angular figure in the heavy exoskeleton looked tiny against the black wall of darkness and kinetic distortion. She raised her railgun slowly, checking the indicator on the last magazine. On her face, beneath its crust of dust and dried blood, there was not a trace of fear, only the endless, burned-to-nothing exhaustion of a person who knows exactly where her last line falls and exactly what her life is worth. Dina looked back at her team. She ran a fast, precise scan over each of them: the frightened Priya, the shaking Garcia, the motionless hawks on the truss. She nodded to Cassidy, and in that gesture there was more meaning than in any last speech. She turned back to face the front, getting a better grip on her weapon. "Hold the line. For the grunt," she ordered, cold and precise, and her voice cut through the drone of approaching death. Wallace fired first. It had started. She knew that in a few minutes the sky would split from the aircraft strikes, but right now there was only this bridge, this barrel in her hands, and this truth they were protecting with their bodies. Every shot echoed in the void, taking a fragment of their souls with it, until the last defensive line had become a burning altar.